Hello, this is Tony Hiller from realclimatescience.com. Fake and misleading graphs and maps are key tools of people pushing climate alarmism. Before I get to my first map, I'm going to briefly review the sea level information from a previous video. In the 1990 IPCC report, they said, there is no convincing evidence of an acceleration in global sea level rise during the 20th century. But that story didn't scare anybody, so history was rewritten. Now the story is, 20th century sea level rise was extremely likely faster than during any of the 27 previous centuries. NASA says they know facts, so let's take a look at their facts page about sea level. In the 2018 version of that website, they showed no acceleration in sea level rise between 1870 and the end of the 20th century. The trend is linear, indicating that sea level has been rising at a constant rate since 1870. But their interpretation of satellite data showed a much faster rate of sea level rise than the tide gauges did. So in order to make the satellite data match the tide gauges, they changed the tide gauge data. Now they show a sharp slowdown in the rate of sea level rise between 1950 and 1994 when the satellites came online, and then a rapid acceleration after that. Let's compare the 2018 version of the tide gauge data with the current version. It's pretty easy to see how NASA tampered with the data. They greatly reduced the sea level rise rate from 1950 to 1994, and then they greatly increased it. They wanted the tide gauge and the satellite data to agree, so they massively tampered with the tide gauge data in order to achieve their goal. Now we're going to look at some very misleading maps about satellite sea level rise rates from the University of Colorado. The bottom map is their trend map, and the top map is their error map. The trend map consists mostly of yellow and red colors, while the error map is mostly blue. What they want you to believe is that the error is much less than the trend. But if we look closer at these maps, we can see some trickery going on. In the trend map, they show 3 millimeters per year as yellow, but in the error map, they show 3 millimeters as blue. So in order to do an apples-to-apples comparison, I corrected the error map. Now both maps have the same scale. 3 millimeters is yellow, 6 millimeters is slightly orange, and 9 millimeters is red. Now we see something completely different. For most of the Earth, the error is just as great or greater than the trend. In other words, the satellite data is completely worthless scientifically. Tide gauges showed that all of the predictions of sea level rise were failing rather badly. So NASA altered the tide gauge data to match their worthless satellite data. There's multiple levels of fraud going on here to deceive the public. Now let's take a look at some data tampering from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This graph shows the measured temperature data from NASA Bahamas measured at two different stations. Both stations showed that NASA was very warm during the late 19th century. And there's been essentially no change in temperature at NASA over the last 140 years. But the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration tampers with the data to create a warming trend which doesn't actually exist. Note that they completely removed all the inconvenient data from the 19th century, which showed that NASA was just as warm then as it is now. This is the measured data, and this is what the data looks like after the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration tampers with it. There's no scientific basis to this data tampering. This map shows where they have temperature data from the year 1905. You can see the two stations in the Bahamas right there. The next closest station is at Miami, which is 170 miles away. In other words, the only two stations within a reasonable radius are these two from the Bahamas, and they both showed that the Bahamas was very warm during the 19th century. There was no scientific basis for NOAA to tamper with the data and to remove the warm temperatures from the late 19th century. They just didn't want people to see that it was just as warm in the Bahamas when carbon dioxide levels were below 300 parts per million. NOAA subtracts almost 4 degrees Fahrenheit from 1923 through 1926 temperatures at one of the stations in the Bahamas. Someone sitting at a desk at NOAA determined that tens of thousands of daily temperature readings taken over the last 140 years at the Bahamas were incorrect, and that he knew better than the person who took the readings. This is rather outrageous behavior, and of course there's no paper trail for this data tampering. I've done a number of software contracts for the government on mission-critical systems. These included commercial and military aircraft as well as military drones. In that environment, every single thing you do has to be very thoroughly documented and reviewed. But for some reason, this sort of junk climate science has been given a pass, and they don't have to follow normal government procedures. Government climate scientists tamper with data and know that they will not have to document it and not ever have to go through any sort of real review. They know that they can create climate junk science with impunity as long as they're pushing the agenda which politicians want to see. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on fake climate maps and graphs for almost 16 years. You can visit him and his family on the web at realclimatescience.com.